if a person ignores trust, well, might be lucky, by pure luck, there might be no adverse effects. So you build a mechanism, ignoring trust, might work. For one reason or the other, maybe just pure luck. Oh, of course, there is a possibility that if you ignore trust, you will bear the cost of the of that, not ignorance, of that ignoring. Next set of trust. If you ignore trust, you will experience higher risks. Next claim. Trust can be used implicitly only after making conscious decision that this is a good assumption, that there is a sufficient trust level. So I'm writing a subsystem, say, okay, I wrote all those components, or my people I trust wrote all those components. I don't need to assign trust levels to every component. They don't have to kind of, look at each other explicitly through the trust value. They implicitly we can assume, okay, we have enough trust for those to by assumption, without detailed consideration of trust. Claim number 5. Having trust in the large is necessary for comprehensive and consistent consideration of trust. I guess it kind of goes back to the definition. Well, that's what how I define TIL. So yeah, the proof is in the definition, kind of, you might say. Of course, I kind of say it with tongue in the cheek. You should have some arguments to prove that claim, or to support that claim. Claim number 6. Trust level, as I have mentioned, is context dependent. You are receiving a certain, you are a, let's say, provider, you receive a security service request. Now, depending on the trust level, you might decide that very strong security service has to be used, heavy duty, heavyweight, or you might say trust level is so good, so high, that I can use very low-key, low-level, lightweight security service. In general, strength of the security service is a function of the trust level. Now, we know that security service is supported by security mechanisms, so you can say kind of similar thing about, well, if I use this security mechanism to support this security service, I have this trust level, similar considerations will apply. All right, so these are the claims that I'm making, and I would love to hear your arguments. I would be happy to receive it through email or any other civilized way. Okay. Security services, we already defined them as CIA-AANN, confidential integrity availability, next row. And I already mentioned. So we are at the moment, we are typically, this actually comes from a standard, this list from a standard, ISO standard listing security services. So this is a current situation, current state of the standard. The question mark is, well, we'll have new security services for future internet? Probably. Somebody will come up with something, probably. Okay, we have seen this picture. Here are some definitions. Now, I try to say, okay, so we have authentication, access control, confidentiality, integrity, non-repudiation, groups of services. At which network layer are they needed? And shaded area says needed. So, authentication needed application layer, transport, and network. Okay? Confidentiality group, look, pretty heavily, only not on session layer. And that will be mentioned later. Basically, the standard claims that security services at session layer are not needed because they are covered either at lower or higher levels. Okay. Non-repudiation group only at the application layer. Here is another view of that, more detailed, because on the previous slide we have seen only groups of services like authentication, access control, confidential, integrity, non-repudiation. Here we see subgroups, or you might say elements, whatever you want. Okay, maybe there are smaller elements within that. They are at least sub-elements of. So again, a little bit more detail. For example, for confidentiality, you see that traffic flow confidentiality is not needed at the presentation layer, and so on. Definitions, which we can skip now. If you go through the slides later, that will be something that you might consider useful. Here I'm reversing that. Actually, this is easier way to read it, because now here you have services, service group and services listed, horizontally rather than vertically. Well, here you have network layers. Just a different view, easier. And I'm mentioning here the ISO standard. Whoops. ISO standard name. It's ISO 7498, which lists all those services and suggests where they should be used. Now, let's take a quick look at security mechanisms that serve all those different services. Here is a sample. The standard doesn't give a big list. We went to a paper and found an example of a sample list of security mechanisms that support security services. Here is an example list. Okay. Of course, now you can say which mechanisms are needed by which layers. Mildly interesting. Which mechanism support which services? More interesting. And again, a bunch of definitions. We started looking at some simple basic trust considerations for different security service groups. Authentication, SSG, access control, and so on. Let's take a look at the first one. When you look at trust consideration for authentication, you find out that traditional authentication relies on trusted third party, TTP. Certification authority, registration authority, right? Optional, but typically used. If you have infrastructure-less network without TTP, you can introduce these are TISs, right? Trust in the small. Pretty good privacy, trust and clustering-based authentication managed on special mechanism, TISs. And other services, confidential integrity and authentication provided by cryptographic digital signatures. You can take a look at each group, okay, and kind of conclusion is that in all those groups, all security service can, maybe don't have to, I don't know, that's should be question mark here rather than saying but don't have to, but yeah. They can be built based on just those security mechanisms, digital signature and digital certificates from TTP. So it seems like this is like a minimal set of mechanisms that can cover, well, maybe not, maybe you need other mechanisms to do it more efficiently, but they, at least in a principle, they can cover, those two security mechanisms can cover the needs of all security services. What could be interesting topics for studying security services, and security mechanisms? We already looked a little bit, but of course much more is needed to look at trust considerations for individual security services. We looked only at some, but in general people looked at many of those. For future investigation, few interesting questions. How to facilitate development or foster development of trust relationships, because the more trust relationship exists, people can find, can basically increase their collaboration using the high trust connections. How well can we build trusted systems from untrustworthy or untrusted low trust components? We succeeded beautifully with building reliable systems from unreliable components in the area of computer reliability, right, or reliability in general. Can we do a similar thing, succeed so well, also doing this instead of with reliability